Hi everyone, welcome to our lecture on early civil rights. So today we're going to be looking at 1950s and 1960s civil rights movement. First, kind of focusing on the origins of civil rights within the 50s. We're going to be looking at white response to this civil rights movement, and then politics in this era. So Black Americans wanted what most other Americans desired after World War II. They wanted the opportunity to make a decent living, buy a nice home, raise a healthy family, and get the best education for their children. Yet Black Americans faced far greater obstacles than did whites in obtaining these dreams, particularly in the South, where Black Americans attended separate and unequal schools, faced discrimination if not outright exclusion from public accommodations, were not permitted to vote, and encountered vigilante violence. So today we are going to be talking mainly about events in the South, but racial injustices by no means were confined only to that region. But it was the Southern states where the Jim Crow systems of laws, combined with a reign of terror to severely restrict Black Americans' political rights, really kind of culminated. And in this way, it was much like the Reconstruction period, where the Southern state governments, along with white terrorist groups, were fighting the federal government's enforcement of civil rights. Fortunately, the Supreme Court led the way at the federal level in supporting the civil rights movement by beginning to declare unconstitutional laws that blatantly restricted Black American civil rights. So the legislative and executive branches, however, lagged behind in enforcing racial equality in the Southern states, and we'll talk about the party politics of civil rights later in this lecture. So this is where the brave and bold actions of the civil rights reformers came into play. Determined to eliminate these injustices, mostly Black but also some socially conscious white Americans mounted a campaign against white supremacy in the decades after World War II. Their persistence made it so the federal government, which was otherwise preoccupied with cultivating a prosperous and tranquil image of the U.S. in the Cold War, couldn't just pass the issue of civil rights off to a future generation. And for this, many Americans today have a lot to be thankful for. Because remember, these civil rights advocates were fighting to write discriminatory laws and practices out of America's laws and everyday life. The United States, as a result of the civil rights movement, was much, much closer to living up to our grand idealistic virtues than at any other point in American history. So Black veterans returning from the Second World War faced a renewed wave of racial violence. The war had changed America's racial landscape in important ways, and these trends heavily affect racial inequities that we see today. We spoke about the Second Great Migration in our discussion on World War II, but Black Americans continued to move out of the South after the war had ended. After 1945, more than 5 million Black folks left the South in search of better jobs, higher wages, decent housing, and greater civil rights. By 1960, for the first time in history, more Black Americans were living in urban areas than in rural areas. As Black folks moved into northern cities, many white residents moved to the suburbs in an event known as white flight. Between 1950 and 1960, some 3.6 million whites left the nation's largest cities for suburban neighborhoods, while 4.5 million Black folks moved into the cities. Nationwide poverty afflicted nearly half of the Black American population, compared to only a quarter of whites. Although by 1950 Black Americans were earning, on average, more than 4 times their 1940 wage, they and other marginalized groups lagged well behind whites in their rate of improvement. In the North, discrimination was not as official as it was in the South, but it was equally real, especially in housing and employment. Deeply entrenched racial attitudes outside of the South forced Black folks to work to counter the hostility they confronted through organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and the National Urban League, and they sought to change the hearts and minds of their white neighbors. However, for all of the racism that Black migrants encountered outside of the South, most found their new lives preferable to the enforced segregation and often violent racism in the South. Under the Jim Crow system in the Southern states, Black Americans still risked being lynched if they registered to vote. So the trend of widespread disenfranchisement was still very much in play. They were also forced to use separate facilities, such as water fountains, restrooms, hotels, theaters, and parks, and to attend segregated schools. Likewise, in the far west, Mexican and other Latino Americans continue to experience ethnic prejudice. Schools in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and California routinely segregated Mexican American children from white children. The 500,000 Latino veterans from World War II were especially frustrated that their efforts in the war were not rewarded with equality at home. They were frequently denied access to educational, medical, and housing benefits available to white servicemen and veterans. And some mortuaries even denied funeral services to Mexican Americans killed in combat. To fight this prejudicial treatment, Latino Americans, led by Hector Perez Garcia, a World War II veteran, organized the American GI Forum in Texas, which later spread across the country. The organization initially focused on veterans' issues, but soon broadened its scope to include equal opportunities and equal treatment for all Americans. And it's important to note that for both of the groups we've talked about so far, most of the official governmental discrimination was occurring at the state level. So the Second World War, as well as the Cold War, presented some unique opportunities for civil rights advocates. A New York Times editorial in 1946 stated, "This is a particularly good time to campaign against the evils of bigotry, prejudice, and race hatred, because we have witnessed the defeat of enemies who tried to found a mastery of the world upon such cruel and fallacious policy." So again, as we've been talking about, we often define ourselves as the polar opposite of our enemies, and at this time that was Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, and later Stalinist Russia. So Black Americans had fought in large numbers to overthrow the Nazi regime of government-sponsored racism, and returning Black veterans were unwilling to put up with racial abuse at home. The Cold War also gave political leaders added incentive to improve race relations in the U.S. The persistent racial violence and the Jim Crow South were increasingly embarrassing for the U.S. on the international stage. We've talked a bit about the moral authority of the United States in international affairs, and it was difficult to say that you are the champion of freedom and justice abroad when entire racial groups are treated as second-class citizens at home. And the Soviets totally recognized this contradiction, and they actually used it to their benefit. So soon after the Cold War began, Soviet diplomats began to use America's racial discrimination against Black Americans as a propaganda tool to illustrate the defects of the American way of life. They often compared racism in the U.S. to the Nazis' brutalization of the Jews. In the ideological contest against capitalism, communists highlighted examples of American racism to win influence among the newly emerging nations of Africa. So at this point, not only was racial discrimination and segregation a betrayal of all of the values that we hold as our country, but it was also becoming a national security issue. And this Cold War context pressure would not have been nearly as intense if brave social justice advocates did not relentlessly push for reform. So the civil rights movement proper really began over segregation in schools in the Jim Crow South. Led by the NAACP, Black Americans launched a prolonged assault on school segregation. Not all Black Americans in the South necessarily wanted their children going to school with white kids, but they saw desegregation as the best and quickest way to secure a quality education. All Black schools typically lacked the resources provided to all white schools. They were underfunded, understaffed, and overcrowded. The NAACP understood that without federal intervention, the Southern state officials would never live up to the separate but equal doctrine asserted in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. They had begun their legal campaign in earnest in the 1930s, but it took until the 1950s to start seeing results. Fortunately for these civil rights reformers, they now had a Supreme Court who was sympathetic to their cause. In 1953, Eisenhower appointed former Republican California Governor Earl Warren to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Warren would serve from 1953 to 1969, and Eisenhower initially thought he would be a safely conservative appointment. But during that time, which is now deemed the Warren Court, it was the judicial branch who really took up the mantle of civil rights. So in the early years of the 1950s, the NAACP and other organizations and individuals began winning cases where the court found that schools were indeed separate, but they were not equal. And this predominantly started with segregation in law schools. In these early cases, the court ordered these schools to either make all of their facilities actually equal or allow Black folks to go to school with whites. But they did not challenge the premise of the constitutionality of separate but equal. This would change with the Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954, and that's why this court case is so important. So the Brown case originated because the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas refused to admit Black students into a public elementary school and required them to take the bus to schools much further away from where they lived. Once the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case went to the Supreme Court in 1952, Eisenhower actually urged Earl Warren to postpone dealing with the case until Eisenhower left office, which would have been 8 years later. When Warren refused, Eisenhower urged him to side with the segregationists. Fortunately, Warren again refused, and in May of 1954, the court voiced its path-breaking decision that stated, quote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place," end quote, effectively overturning the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling. The justices relied on a variety of sociological and psychological studies supplied by the NAACP and legendary lawyer Thurgood Marshall to show that even if racially separate schools were equal in quality, the very practice of separating students by race caused feelings of inferiority among Black children and feelings of superiority among white children. So it was saying that separate facilities were inherently unequal and therefore violated the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment. So although it was focused on schools, it left real room for future claims that segregation in other facilities and services were unconstitutional as well. A year later, the court directed